You've heard the stories of the Blitz, the sirens, the shelters, and the defiance of London. But what if I told you that the bombing of London was actually the greatest gift the British military ever received? It sounds like heresy, but the data tells a different story. While the world watched the fires in the East End, the Nazi High Command was busy committing strategic suicide. Tonight, we're going beyond the headlines of 1940 to uncover how Hitler's thirst for retribution blinded his generals and saved the Royal Air Force from total extinction. It wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in how to lose a war you've already won. Most of us were raised with the idea that history is a series of inevitable victories and defeats, carved into stone by the great men of the era. But if you look closer at the late summer of 1940, you'll find that the fate of the free world didn't hinge on a grand design, but on a single, ego-driven mistake. We often think of the Nazi war machine as a cold, calculating juggernaut, a monster of pure logic. The reality, however, was far more fragile. It was a regime blinded by its own Mirage of Invincibility, and it was about to trade its best chance at a total victory for a hollow act of revenge. By August 1940, the Luftwaffe had the Royal Air Force by the throat. This wasn't a stalemate, it was a slow-motion execution. The German strategy was working. They were systematically dismantling the RAF's eyes and ears, the sector stations and the airfields of 11 Group in southeast England. Many of you might remember the stories of the few, but the cold data of the time tells a grimmer story. The RAF was losing pilots and planes faster than they could be replaced. They were, quite literally, days away from a total collapse of their defensive umbrella over the English Channel. But here is where the logic of war was subverted by the vanity of a dictator. On the night of August 24th, a few lost German bombers, struggling with primitive navigation, accidentally dropped their payloads on civilian London instead of their military targets. It was a mistake, a technical glitch in the machine. In a rational world, a commander would have corrected the course and stayed the path. But Winston Churchill, a man who understood the psychology of the bully better than anyone, didn't let the mistake go unpunished. He launched a retaliatory strike on Berlin the very next night. The damage to Berlin was minimal, but the damage to Hitler's ego was catastrophic. He had promised the German people that a single enemy bomb would never fall on the capital. Suddenly, the Mirage of Invincibility was punctured. In a fit of pique, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to stop attacking the RAF airfields, which were on the verge of breaking, and instead pivot their entire weight toward the terror bombing of London. This was the logic of ruin. By choosing to punish the British people rather than destroy the British military, Hitler gave the RAF the one thing they couldn't buy: time. Time to repair the runways, time to train new pilots, and time to breathe. It was the moment the Blitz backfired before it even truly began. In the late summer of 1940, the British public was bracing for an invasion that felt like a mathematical certainty. Many of you have seen the grainy footage of the little ships at Dunkirk, but what followed was far more clinical and dangerous. The German High Command, the OKL, wasn't interested in terror yet. They were interested in a surgical, precision trap. They knew that for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of England, to succeed, the Royal Air Force had to be erased from the sky. And by August, they were doing exactly that with terrifying efficiency. The trap was centered on the 11 Group fighter stations in southeast England, places like Biggin Hill, Kenley, and Hornchurch. The Luftwaffe wasn't just carpet bombing, they were targeting the nervous system of the British defense. They hit the sector operations rooms, the telephone lines buried beneath the earth, and the radar masts that acted as Britain's early warning system. If you lose the ability to see the enemy coming, you've already lost the war. By the final week of August, the RAF was bleeding out. They were losing 20% of their fighter strength every week. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, the man in charge of defending London, later admitted that the margin of survival had been stripped down to a few days of fuel and a handful of exhausted pilots. Imagine for a moment the strain on a 19-year-old pilot in a Spitfire. These young men were flying 6 or 7 sorties a day. They weren't landing on pristine runways. They were dodging bomb craters and landing on grass strips while the ground crews worked frantically to patch holes in the fuselage with doped linen. The precision trap was working because it forced the RAF into a war of attrition they could not win. The Germans had more planes, more seasoned pilots from the Spanish Civil War, and the tactical advantage of the Schwarm finger-4 formation, a more flexible way of flying than the rigid British Vic formation. History often ignores the logistical reality of this moment. We like to think of the Spitfire summer as a glorious dogfight, but it was actually a grueling demolition job. The Luftwaffe's Dorniers and Heinkels were hitting the aircraft factories themselves. In late August, a series of raids on the Vickers-Armstrong's factory at Weybridge and the Supermarine Works at Southampton threatened to cut off the supply of new planes entirely. The precision trap was closing. If the Luftwaffe had stayed the course for just 2 more weeks, targeting the airfields and the factories, the RAF would have been forced to withdraw its remaining fighters north of the Midlands. The skies over the English Channel would have been clear for the German Navy. So, why didn't it happen? Why did a military that had spent years perfecting blitzkrieg suddenly abandon the very strategy that was bringing them to the brink of total victory? The answer lies in the friction between military reality and political vanity. The Luftwaffe was almost there, but almost is a dangerous word in a dictatorship. The German intelligence service, the Abwehr, was feeding Hermann Göring inflated numbers, suggesting the RAF was already down to its last 50 planes. This created a false sense of completion. When you believe your enemy is already dead, you stop aiming for the heart and start looking for a way to humiliate the corpse. The German pilots themselves knew the truth. They saw the Hurricanes and Spitfires rising to meet them day after day, despite the reports saying the RAF was finished. But in the halls of the Reich Chancellery, the map was being read differently. They were tired of the slog of hitting airfields. They wanted a knockout blow, a silver bullet that would force Churchill to the negotiating table without the need for a risky amphibious landing. This brings us to a crucial lesson in leadership that resonates even today. The moment you stop listening to the men on the ground and start believing your own propaganda, the precision trap becomes a trap for the hunter, not the hunted. The Luftwaffe had the RAF on the ropes, but they were about to make a pivot that defied every principle of Clausewitzian warfare. They were about to trade a strategic victory for an emotional one. The shift from a winning military strategy to an emotional vendetta is one of history's most profound warnings. It is the moment where the therefore of our narrative takes a dark, illogical turn. Because the British had dared to strike Berlin, Hermann Göring, a man whose vanity was as inflated as his medals, decided that the destruction of the RAF was no longer enough. He wanted to break the British soul. To understand the weight of this pivot, we have to look at the man holding the stopwatch. Hermann Göring, the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, was a Great War ace who had traded his cockpit for a palace. He was a man of the grand gesture. By early September 1940, he was frustrated. His intelligence officers, led by the perpetually optimistic Beppo Schmidt, were telling him the RAF was down to its last few Spitfires. Yet every time the Luftwaffe crossed the Channel, those last few fighters rose up like ghosts to meet them. There's a specific psychological phenomenon that happens to leaders when reality refuses to align with their ego. They stop looking for the why and start looking for the who to punish. On September 2nd, the German command issued a directive that changed the course of the 20th century. They ordered a cessation of the concentrated attacks on the RAF's sector stations. This was the equivalent of a boxer having his opponent pinned against the ropes, gasping for air, and then deciding to stop punching the ribs so he could turn around and shout at the crowd. Therefore, the Luftwaffe pivoted. On September 7th, a massive armada of nearly 1,000 aircraft, 348 bombers escorted by over 600 fighters, did not head for the airfields of Biggin Hill or Kenley. Instead, they steered their noses toward the docks of London's East End. For the German pilots, this felt like the endgame. They believed they were flying over a defeated nation, delivering the final crushing blow to its capital. They saw the smoke rising from the Thames and assumed the war would be over by Christmas. But what Göring failed to grasp was the law of unintended consequences. By moving the target from the airfields to the city, he inadvertently handed the RAF a strategic lifeline. When the Germans attacked the coastal airfields, the British had very little time to react. The radar pings gave them mere minutes to scramble. But when the target became London, the German bombers were forced to fly further inland, deep into hostile territory. This extra distance provided the tactical breathing room the British had been praying for. It gave the RAF controllers time to assemble big wings, large organized formations of fighters that could meet the bombers in force rather than in piecemeal scraps. More importantly, it meant the German Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, which had a notoriously short range, only had about 10 to 20 minutes of fuel on target over London before they had to turn back or risk ditching in the Channel. Göring's choice of retribution over strategy was a gift to his enemy. While London burned, the RAF's ground crews were doing something miraculous. For the first time in weeks, they weren't being bombed. They were filling in craters, splicing telephone wires, and resting. The nervous system of the British defense, which had been on the verge of a total blackout, began to flicker back to life.
We often hear about the Blitz spirit, but we rarely talk about the Blitz logistics. Because Göring shifted the focus, the British aircraft factories like the Castle Bromwich Spitfire works were able to ramp up production without the constant interruption of air raid sirens. By mid-September, Britain was actually producing more fighters per month than Germany. The retribution was visible and terrifying to the civilians on the ground, but beneath the surface, the military math was swinging violently back in favor of the British. Imagine the conversation in the Luftwaffe mess halls during those weeks. The veterans, men who had flown over Poland and France, knew the RAF wasn't dead. They were seeing more British fighters, not fewer. They were seeing better coordination. But Göring, blinded by the smoke rising from London's docks, reported back to Hitler that the British air umbrella had been folded. He was so convinced of his own success that he invited the press to watch the final destruction of London from the cliffs of Cap Gris. This is the danger of a leader who prioritizes the optics of a victory over the mechanics of a victory. Göring wanted the headlines. He wanted the images of a burning metropolis to cow the world. But in war, an enemy that is humiliated but not disarmed is the most dangerous enemy of all. By choosing to strike at the heart of the British people rather than the wings of the British military, Göring didn't just fail to win the Battle of Britain, he ensured that the invasion of England would never happen. The pivot was a failure of the highest order because it ignored the fundamental rule of combat: finish the job before you celebrate the win. As the fires raged in the East End, the RAF was quietly rebuilding its strength, preparing for the massive air battles of September 15, a day that would prove once and for all that Göring's retribution had bought the British the very thing that would destroy his Luftwaffe. This is where the German High Command ran headlong into a variable they hadn't accounted for in their spreadsheets: the nonlinear nature of human defiance. In a laboratory, if you apply enough pressure to a structure, it eventually snaps. But history, especially the history many of us lived through or studied in the shadows of the greatest generation, shows that a nation is not a laboratory. When Hitler and Göring shifted the Luftwaffe's crosshairs toward London's East End and the docks, they weren't just aiming for buildings, they were aiming for a psychological collapse. The German theory of total war suggested that if you made life unbearable for the civilian population, they would eventually rise up and demand their government sue for peace. It was a logical, cold-blooded calculation, but the British response defied that logic entirely. Instead of fracturing under the weight of the bombs, the social fabric of London began to crystallize into something harder and more resilient than anyone in Berlin had anticipated. To understand why this miscalculation was so profound, you have to look at the specifics of the suffering. Starting on September 7, 1940, London was bombed for 57 consecutive nights. Imagine that for a moment. Nearly 2 months where the sun went down and the sirens began their low, mournful wail. The East End, populated by dock workers and immigrant families, took the brunt of it. These were people with the least to lose, yet they became the front line of the resistance. The non-linear response was this: the more the Germans destroyed, the less the British feared them. The German intelligence reports, the distorted data that drove Hitler's decisions, suggested that the British were a class-divided society on the verge of a revolution. They believed the working class would resent the monarchy for dragging them into a rich man's war. They expected riots. They expected a breakdown of the rule of law. What they got instead was the tube shelter culture. When the government initially refused to let citizens use the underground stations as bomb shelters, the people didn't riot against the king. They simply hopped the turnstiles and organized themselves. They created their own committees, their own sanitation rules, and their own sense of community 200 feet below the pavement. Every bomb that fell provided a strategic windfall for the British government. They realized that the terror was actually acting as a unifying force. There is a famous story from this period, one that many of our fathers likely shared, about the bombing of Buckingham Palace. When the Queen Mother surveyed the damage to her home, she didn't call for a truce. She famously said, "I'm glad we'd been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." This wasn't just propaganda. It was a total failure of German information operations. While the Luftwaffe was burning through its elite pilot pool and its dwindling fuel reserves, they were achieving the exact opposite of their goal. They were turning a hesitant, war-weary public into a singular, motivated weapon. The therefore of the Blitz was supposed to be a British surrender. Instead, it became the therefore of British resolve. But there was a technical side to this miscalculation as well. As the Luftwaffe focused on London, they were forced to fly in tighter formations to protect their bombers. This made them easier targets for the newly reorganized RAF. On September 15, now celebrated as Battle of Britain Day, the Germans launched 2 massive waves against London, convinced the RAF was down to its last 50 planes. To their horror, they were met by over 300 British fighters in a perfectly coordinated defense.
This was the critical tactical advantage born from the RAF's patience. Because the Germans were hitting London instead of the airfields, the British controllers at Uxbridge could see the gaps in the German escort patterns with clarity. They realized that the German Bf 109 fighters, which were the only real threat to the British Spitfires, had to turn back for France after only 10 minutes of combat over London. The British pilots simply waited. They waited until the German fighters hit their bingo fuel, that desperate point of no return, and had to turn for home. Then the RAF pounced on the defenseless bombers with devastating precision. The statistics of that single day, September 15, broke the German back. They lost 56 aircraft to the RAF's 28. It wasn't just the numbers, it was the realization that the British spirit was non-linear. It was growing stronger under the very pressure meant to crush it. The German pilots returned to their bases in France in a state of shock. They had been told the RAF was dead. Instead, they had flown into a hornet's nest. For the men in this audience, you know that a bully's logic only works as long as the victim stays down. Once the victim stands up and says, "Is that all you've got?" the bully has no plan B. Hitler's plan B was the Blitz, a shift to night bombing. He admitted, in private, that the daylight air war had failed. By shifting to the night, he was essentially admitting that the Luftwaffe could no longer face the RAF in a fair fight. The London miscalculation was the ultimate proof that strategy cannot be built on ego. Hitler and Göring focused on the optics of burning London, but they ignored the mechanics of the British soul. They forgot that the British people, much like the American generation that followed them into the fray, were not a collection of data points on a map. They were a community that viewed every fallen brick as a reason to fight harder. As we move into the final chapters of this collapse, we see the consequence of this error. Because the British spirit didn't break, the German military was forced into a war of attrition it was never designed to win. The Mirage of Invincibility was gone, replaced by the cold, hard reality that the unstoppable Luftwaffe had been stopped by a few hundred pilots and a city that refused to blink. In the world of intelligence and high-stakes command, there is a saying, "A general is only as good as his maps." But what happens when the maps are intentionally drawn to please the man at the top? This is the core of the intelligence gap that doomed the Luftwaffe. It wasn't just a failure of technology or a lack of spies, it was a systemic collapse of truth. Because Hitler and Göring demanded victory, their subordinates began to manufacture it on paper. To understand the sheer scale of this delusion, we have to look at the man responsible for the facts reaching Hitler's desk, Joseph Beppo Schmid, the head of Luftwaffe intelligence. For those of us who have spent a lifetime in business or the military, we know the danger of a yes man. Schmid was the ultimate example. He knew that Göring didn't want to hear about British resilience or industrial capacity. He wanted to hear that the decadent English were on their last legs. Therefore, the German intelligence apparatus began a process of self-blinding. They relied on a flawed method of counting kills in the air. If 3 different German pilots fired at the same Spitfire, it was often recorded as 3 separate kills. By late August, according to the German charts, the RAF had been destroyed twice over. This wasn't just a clerical error, it was a strategic catastrophe. When Hitler looked at the reports, he saw a vacuum where the British air defense should be. He made his decisions based on a phantom reality. When his frontline generals, the men actually flying the missions, tried to warn him that the British were still fighting with incredible ferocity, they were dismissed as pessimists or defeatists. For any of us who have led organizations or managed men, the principle is clear. The most dangerous thing a leader can do is create an environment where the truth is punished and comfortable lies are validated. Hitler didn't just lose the Battle of Britain because of the Spitfire or the radar, he lost it because he had successfully disconnected his command structure from reality. This intelligence gap ensured that every strategic decision made from September onwards was built on a foundation of sand, a fatal error in judgment that no amount of firepower could fix. In the final reckoning of 1940, the smoke over London eventually cleared, revealing a landscape that had changed the world forever. We often look back at the Blitz with a sense of solemnity for the victims, and rightly so. But for the student of history and the man who appreciates the cold mechanics of leadership, this wasn't just a military report, it was a strategic balance sheet of a different kind. It is the record of how a superpower, at the height of its technical and tactical prowess, fooled itself into a corner from which there was no escape. History is often kind to the victim who stands their ground. We find honor in the struggle of the few and the resilience of the Londoners who slept in the tubes. But history is merciless toward the fool, the leader who holds every card in his hand and throws them away because he cannot control his own temperament. By October 1940, the statistics of the Battle of Britain were final. The Luftwaffe had lost nearly 1,900 aircraft. More importantly, they had lost the aura of invincibility that had paralyzed Europe for 3 years. The cost of Hitler's mistake was not just a lost battle, it was a lost war. Because the Luftwaffe failed to secure the skies, Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of England, was postponed indefinitely. This forced Hitler to turn his eyes toward the east, toward the Soviet Union, with a Western front that was still very much alive and kicking. The fool believed he could ignore a wounded lion at his back while he went to hunt a bear in the woods. Therefore, the legacy of the Blitz is one of strategic bankruptcy. The German military machine, built for short, sharp stabs, found itself locked in a long-term war of industrial production against the British Empire and, eventually, the United States. They had traded their elite pilots for a few weeks of headline-grabbing terror. By the time the German generals realized the scale of the error, the RAF was no longer just defending, it was beginning to grow into the force that would eventually carry the fire back to Berlin. We look back at this moment not just to remember the bravery, but to remember the lesson. Power is useless without a clear head to guide it. Hitler and Göring had the superior numbers, the superior experience, and the strategic upper hand. But they were fools because they let their egos dictate their targets. They attacked the pride of a nation rather than the planes of its military, and in doing so, they gave a dying cause the one thing it needed to win, a reason to never give up. The final toll was more than just metal and lives, it was the death of the Nazi dream of a quick victory. For those of us who value logic and steady-handed leadership, the Battle of Britain stands as the ultimate proof that in the theater of war, an angry heart will always be defeated by a cool, calculating mind. History isn't just a record of what happened, it's a toolkit for understanding the world we live in today. If you value this kind of deep-dive analysis, the kind that respects the facts and the men who lived them, I'd be honored to have you join our community. Liking this video helps ensure that these stories reach the next generation, and subscribing to the channel means you won't miss our next investigation into the turning points of our shared history. But more importantly, I want to hear from you. Many of you have your own connection to this era, whether through family stories or your own studies. Leave a comment below and let's keep the conversation going. Your perspective adds a layer of depth that no textbook can match. Thank you for your time and for keeping the truth of history alive.